I start assembling my research, and as soon as I mentioned the story of Nick Farr-Jones throwing the sandshore at Alan Jones's head, as soon as I hear that story, maybe he didn't throw it at his head, he got very angry at him, he threw something at him, I can't remember what it was now, but as soon as I came across that, I go, what a great story is that? That has to go into my book. So I actually do the process as I'm researching. I'm taking the golden jewels. I'm taking the stuff out of the pile that is just fantastic, and I'm writing it, and then I sort out in what chronology it goes. And the more I then know, the more research I do, the more I realise, gee, I need to know more about that. So when I was doing this book, one point came along. I had no idea that the first person to fly, publicly acknowledged to the first person to fly in Australia, was a man by the name of Harry Houdini. Now, many of you, I think, will be familiar with the name Houdini as the world's great escapologist. And it so happened that he was in Europe at the time that flying was literally taking off, and he realised in terms of getting people's attention, there is nothing better than that. So he bought a plane in France, he got some lessons, he disassembled it, he brought it to Australia, and down at the place called Diggers Rest on March 18, 1910, he took off for the first time and he flew for a minute, and he landed and he was exultant. And he said, I can fly, I can fly. And a kookaburra had landed on the wing and went, ooh, ooh, ah. And Houdini laughed and said, he's saying I can't fly at all. Now that's an example where when I began my research on that book, I had no idea of Houdini. But then as soon as I find out about that, I say to myself, what a great story is that? So I start my research on that. And in many ways, my research is guided by, I am not an historian, I'm a historian. And what I mean by that is, when I read Manning Clark, for example, or Geoffrey Blaney, I look at their stuff and I think, geez, they tell their stories against the broad sweep of history. They're trained historians, they're wonderful historians, and they don't just do what I do. In many ways, I love the anecdote part of history. I love the story part of history. And so with my research, I'm actually guided by what I think are killer stories far more than I'm guided by what I think is important history. No, but nothing I can say specifically, but what I try to do is when I, for example, to write the scenes, the famous plane that King FitzSimons had was a Fokker, a 3-engine Fokker, and it was called the Southern Cross. And for me to write about what it was like to be in that cockpit, I needed to get to the Southern Cross. So the Southern Cross is now actually at Brisbane. So I went up there when I was in Brisbane to have a good look at the Southern Cross. It wasn't possible to get inside, but there was a replica of the Southern Cross down just south of Wollongong at a place called Albion Park. So my friend, in fact, Nick Farr-Jones, organised for me to go down there because a friend of his owned this replica. And it's when you're, as much as possible, it was when I'm in the cockpit of the Southern Cross replica that I get some understanding of what it must be like. When I was writing my book on the Kokoda track, I couldn't have done the job properly unless I personally had walked the Kokoda track. So I had respect for what the diggers did walking the Kokoda track before I did it, but it was only when walking it myself with the sweat pouring out of me and the exhaustion of going up the hills and stumbling down the other side, falling and grabbing vines and being thirsty and sleeping and mosquitoes and that, it's only when I experienced that I could properly write what it was like on the Kokoda track. But the only 2 or 3 times have I felt like I'm in the presence of greatness. And the one I particularly cite was the man who, with Tenzing Norgay, was one of the first two to get to the top of Everest, Mount Everest, and that was Sir Edmund Hillary. And in about 1995, I was in Auckland, and I said to a friend of mine, gee, I'd like to interview Sir Edmund Hillary. How do you think I might get a hold of him? And he said, well, you could try the phone book. So I picked up the Auckland telephone directory, and there was Sir Edmund Hillary, 278A Remuera Road, North Auckland. Called him up and he said, yes, sure, come over for an interview. And so if there is a synonym for achievement in our time, it is Everest, the climbing of Everest. And for me, I felt this extraordinary privilege to be in the presence of this man. Funny you should say that. When I first approached Kim Beazley, he basically said, well, hang on, mate, my life's only half over. You know, like I'm not ready. And I certainly feel like that for me. I feel like I'm just, you know, I'm only breaking into stride now. I'm not ready for a biography. But many of you may be familiar. There's some fantastic books. Hugh Lunn wrote a book, Memoirs of Growing Up in Queensland, called Over the Top with Jim. There's another book, A.B. Facey wrote A Fortunate Life, growing up in Western Australia in the early 1900s. Clive James wrote about growing up in Sydney in the 1950s, called Unreliable Memoirs, and he did a series of them. And for me, I'm now about 85,000 words in to a book called A Simpler Time, and it's about growing up. I grew up in a place an hour north of Sydney, a place called Peats Ridge, and I was the youngest of 7 children. And one of the lines I like, they say if you had a happy childhood, when you look back upon it, you look back upon your childhood, they say if you had a happy childhood, you remember the sun shining. If you had an unhappy childhood, you remember wet Wednesday afternoons, trudging home from school with the rain trickling down your neck. Now for me, when I look back on growing up in Peats Ridge in the 1960s on a citrus orchard, youngest of 7 children, I remember the sun shining. So in terms of a biography of me, I'm writing, I'm not being mealy mouthed and humble, I'm not worthy of a biography, but I want to try to encapsulate what those times were like in 1960. And here's the answer. I mentioned Great Expectations with Charles Dickens, and many of you, Great Expectations, Famous Five, Biggles and so forth. And the answer is, when I'm reading Great Expectations, I'm absolutely loving it. Nevertheless, there is a little voice whispering to me saying, as I'm reading it, this didn't happen. There was no Miss Havisham. There was no wedding cake. There was no Pip. There was no Estella. Biggles, I love Biggles. If you may not be familiar with Biggles, Biggles was Lieutenant Bigglesworth, and he was a flyer in the Second World War. And you're reading it and you're loving it, but a little voice says, it actually didn't happen. Whereas, when you're writing non-fiction, if you get into non-fiction, it is a wonderful thing if you can find a story that is so absorbing, and instead of the little voice coming saying, it didn't happen, there's a bigger voice that says, geez, this actually happened. This is true. I can't believe that. Here's a very quick example. I mentioned our Aboriginal past. There's a stunning story. Tim Flannery has written a book called On the History of Sydney, and it's an anthology of historical text. And here's the story, that in 1788, when Captain Phillip came through the heads of Botany Bay, there were Aboriginal people with spears fishing in their canoes. And out of the blue comes this enormous ship. And by the historical account, the Aborigines didn't look up. I mean, they didn't look up. They didn't initially throw their spears. They didn't initially shake their fist. The historical account is they didn't look up. And that is what happened. And for me, that is such a powerful story because, geez, how amazing. And that really happened. And then if you get into what happened, no time for it now, but you get into what happened down at Sydney Harbour on the night of February 6th, 1788, when you find out, if you read Tim Flannery's book, February 6, 1788, read that part. It is stunning. And as you read it, it's non-fiction, as you read it, you go, I can't believe it, this really happened. Good luck, God bless in the big city, good luck with your studies, goodbye. Thank you.